Fully enclosed basket hilts offer an enormous range of advantages in combat, as well as some disadvantages which we're going to look at here. But the main question is, why did only three cultures, really three groups of people in history, really develop fully enclosed basket hilts? Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria, and this is partially an excuse for me to show you this amazing new basket hilted sword, which is a ribbon hilted, beak nosed style of hilt of the late 17th, early 18th century, this particular variety. I'll probably do a dedicated video on Scottish basket hilts at some point quite soon, but this is from Armour Class, and I picked it up from Torm the other day. For those of you who know what that is, it's a market. Right, so we're looking at basket hilts here, and the real main question of this video is, why really did only three main cultures develop and extensively use fully enclosed basket hilts in history? Why didn't more people adopt it? And why did those three cultures adopt the fully enclosed basket hilt? So who are those three cultures, first of all? Well, first of all, we'll loosely call it the British. We'll unpack that in a second, but really we're talking here about primarily the English and the Scottish, although tangentially you could say the Irish and the Welsh as well, but mostly the English and the Scottish. Let's call these the British. Secondly, there's the southern Germans and Austrians, okay? Styria, this kind of southern Germany region here, but essentially a group of Germans and Austrians. And finally, it's the Venetians, okay? Right, so those three groups of people all developed fully enclosed basket hilts. Now, what I happen to be holding here is one of the last stage prototypes before it gets launched from the windlass Royal Armoury's Matt Easton range, and this is an exact one-to-one replica of an early basket hilt in the Royal Armouries here in the UK. And this is a Tudor period sword. Now the reason I'm holding this, it's actually very apt for this video, these are some of the earliest basket hilts that you can find anywhere in the world. So it does seem that the British very early on developed basket hilts as early as 1520. Really, really early. I mean, bear in mind, we go back to 1490, most swords just look like medieval swords with a simple cross hilt. So the fact that 30, 35 years later, we've got basket hilts is really an amazing leap forward in technology or development, evolution of swords. And of course the big question is, why? Why did they develop them? Why was it primarily only the English and Scots at that time doing it? And additionally, the Germans, okay? So particularly the southern Germans and Austrians, they also developed a form of basket hilt. And again, we see these at about the same time. So around 1525, 1535, this kind of period, these start to become more popular in that area. And then in the next few decades, we start to see the development of the Venetian schiavona, okay, in Venice, but in the lands around Venice, because Venice wasn't just Venice as you know it now. It was actually a whole area controlled by Venice. And the Schiavona were originally mercenaries from what later became known as Yugoslavia. So we're looking here at places like Slovenia and Croatia, bits of Serbia probably as well. So essentially Slavic mercenaries. But in addition to that, a lot of the Schiavoni were actually also the Venetians as well, who kind of adopted that way of life and culture and stuff. So. But fundamentally, we've got these three main groups, and they're all developing basket hilts in the early, or should we say the second quarter, really, of the first to second quarter of this 16th century. That is the 1500s. And of course, the main questions we're looking at here is why? Why were they developing basket hilts when other nations weren't, really? And secondly, why did they want basket hilts, and why were they the only ones who really did that? To try and answer that question, or at least give some possible conjectural answers to those questions, we need to first of all consider what is the basket hilt and what does it achieve? What are the negatives of it as well? Well, let's look at the negatives first. So the negatives of a basket hilt are, it makes the sword more complicated and potentially expensive to make. It potentially makes it heavier. It potentially makes it harder to access the grip quickly when you need to if you're wearing it at your side, and this is mentioned in a couple of historical sources where the basket hilt's being worn and the basket hilt can, depending on the angle of it, can get in the way of you quickly getting the hand around the grip. And potentially also it can also get in the way of shields and bucklers being used. Anyone that ever does basket, hilt and buckler, as I very occasionally do, they do tend to clash together a little bit. And lastly also we have to remember that swords are predominantly worn. They spend a lot more time being worn than actually in the hand, and basket hilts can be rather uncomfortable and inconvenient to wear because you've got a great big essentially ball basket at the back end of the sword. But the advantages are obvious. When we're using another type of sword, if I just grab a saber here, one of the prime things which is going to get injured in any type of sword fighting, and anyone that does medieval styles of fencing, longsword, sword and buckler, side sword, things like this, will get hit in the hand quite a lot. And as Manciolino says in his treatise, that's the thing that you offend most easily because it's nearest to you and it's the thing that's holding the weapon. Anybody that's done Filipino martial arts will know the same thing. So hands that can be hit should be hit because they're the thing which offend you the most, and you can get to them, and they're soft, meaty targets which can be easily injured. As soon as you put a basket hilt around your hand, one of the most delicate and important bits of your body is entirely encased in steel, or sometimes brass, but entirely encased and protected in a way that basically no other sword achieves. Now, obviously there are other swords that have complex handguards, there's rapiers and various other things. Sabres have some form of hand protection and knucklebow and sidebars. And later on, and we'll come back to the cutlass a little bit later in this video, later on you do have even more encased guards, but this is still at best only a half basket. It doesn't fully enclose the hand, it's still vulnerable at the bottom, it's still vulnerable on the inside line here. But as I say, we'll come back to cutlasses of this type of bowl guard a little bit later. So the question is, why didn't more people do that, essentially? Why didn't more people encase the hand in metal? And also an important side note to the last point is that it doesn't only protect the hand. Any of us who use basket hilts in sparring, as many people I know do, and some of my friends absolutely specialise in basket hilted broadswords and backswords in fencing. I don't personally, but I do use them occasionally. I have practice versions. And one of the notable things about these is not only do they protect the hand, but because the basket's so big, it actually makes it easier to protect the head from high blows up here, for example, when you're using hanging guards. And additionally, if you're on guard with the arm extended, it also makes it far harder to get to the person's arm because that big basket not only protects the hand, but provides a bigger kind of cone of defense to the sword arm behind it as well. So they actually protect all of you, not just your hand. So let's look at 5 possible conjectural reasons why basket hilts developed and why they were preferred to be used by those 3 particular groups of historical people. So one of the first points that often comes up when people discuss this point is these were coming about in the early part of the 16th century. Now something else was also starting to become more prevalent in the 16th century. Guns! Guns and firearms of various sorts. Long guns, short guns, all sorts of guns, and of course cannons on board ships. So this is very similar. This is a very similar type of sword to the Mary Rose sword, although this particular one isn't from the Mary Rose. It's in the Royal Armouries, but it's very similar to a sword that was found on the Mary Rose. So these were being used in 1545 when the Mary Rose sunk. Almost identical to this. In fact, the Mary Rose one's a bit smaller, the Royal Armouries one's a bit bigger. But at that time, there were all sorts of firearms being used. There were pistols, there were long muskets, arquebuses essentially. There were numerous types of cannon, there were swivel guns, and even there were guns mounted into shields. There were gun shields, maybe we'll look at those in the future. So therefore, how does that relate to basket hilts? Because your hand is or both your hands are very important to the loading, cocking and operation of firearms. So potentially one answer is that at a time when people increasingly needed the dexterity of their hands, they couldn't wear gauntlets in many cases, but they even couldn't wear gloves because you need to be able to load your gun, you need to be able to ram it, you need to be able to find the musket ball and the powder and all that kind of stuff. You need to be able to cock the gun, close the frizz and all of that sort of stuff. This is a later flintlock, of course, but this is just giving you an impression of the fact that you need manual dexterity. So let's put that pistol carefully down, so it's a nice antique. So therefore, in an age when various types of firearms are being used, Therefore, you've got bare hands, and therefore you might need a basket hilt. Of course, we possibly could even extrapolate this to the use of bows and crossbows earlier, because we know that the earliest developments of complex hilts, things like finger rings and side bars and side rings and knuckle bows, often seem to be associated with more lightly armoured, lightly equipped soldiers like archers and crossbowmen, and indeed gunners. So it's possible that those things start to come around for the exact same reasons as basket hilts develop later on. But there's a problem. The big problem is it wasn't only the British, the Southern Germans and Austrians and the Venetians who were using firearms. Of course, everyone else was. The rest of the Italians and the French and the Spanish and the Portuguese and the Dutch and the Polish and everyone, the Ottomans, everybody was using firearms. So the question is, why would only these people using basket hilts need basket hilts when theoretically that would be a perfectly good reason for all the other people to have basket hilts as well? So I'm not saying that this point is completely wrong, but I think that that might be a general reason why more complex and more developed hilts like swept hilts and, you know, finger rings and knuckle bows and sidebars and all of these things, that might be why essentially the rapier hilt or the walloon hilt and various other types of hilt that developed came about. But it doesn't really explicitly explain why the fully encased basket hilt came around in these three particular areas. So next I started to think, well, what's specific to the British Isles? What do we know in the 16th century that starts to happen with things which are used with basket hilted swords? And that brings us to the topic of shields. Now I'm holding a replica here of a sort of Viking era Anglo-Saxon period shield. So it's kind of irrelevant to basket hilts, but it's to make a point. So usually we explain the reason why you don't need extensive hand protection on a sword, whether it's Bronze Age or Roman or Anglo-Saxon or whatever, used with a shield, is because the shield blocks or defends the line that your arm is extended with the sword. So long as you're holding the shield extended, then indeed your hand, your sword arm and your hand are pretty well protected. So a simple cross hilt or no hilt at all, as we saw on the Bronze Age sword video I did not that long ago, is more or less protected by the shield. However, if we look at the British Isles in the 16th century, we actually start to see that by and large, although large shields are still around, we start to see a general reduction in the size of shield. Now, in fact, the humble buckler had been around for a long, long time, going well back and becoming very popular in the 13th and 14th centuries. And this was a particularly popular sidearm to be used with a sword in England and Scotland as well, and other bits of the British Isles, but particularly the English were famous for sword and buckler, so much so that their archers, it was regarded as this was pretty much their standard sidearm set, was the sword and buckler. Now, if you are a culture that makes a lot of use of the buckler, and bear in mind in the 16th century in Italy, for example, the Italians had also been quite famous for the sword and buckler. And still in 1530, they were still famous for sword and buckler, but by 1550, they were starting to use, increasingly so, the rapier and dagger, or at least the side sword and dagger. So in Italy, they pretty much by 1550 had started to supplant in common usage the buckler with the dagger. The dagger's easier to wear, it's a standard sidearm, and it's better against thrusting fencing styles. So against an opponent who predominantly used their point, it can be argued that a dagger is a better weapon than a buckler because the dagger can interpose and kind of catch and deflect thrusts better than a buckler can. Buckler's better against cuts. However, the British were famous for continuing to use bucklers, so much so most of them were armed with bucklers on the Mary Rose. And they were still using, at the end of the 1500s, up until 1580, 1590, most English who duelled in the City of London and appear in the coroner's rolls were using sword and buckler, whereas the people using the fancy new Italian imported weapons were using rapier and dagger. So this is the period of George Silver, where there is essentially a battle going on between those who prefer the sword and buckler and those who prefer the rapier and dagger. Now, at this time, the sword predominantly being used was a basket hilt of kinds, an earlier type. And this, in fact, let's go to the earlier type, more like this. So the backsword or broadsword, the basket hilt with the buckler, was very popular in Britain. Now, if you're using a buckler, however you're holding it, whether you're moving it in and out as some styles do, whether you're protecting the hand, that's more of an early thing with 133, You don't need to do that so much with a basket hilt, so if you're just holding it out Bolognese style, then having more hand protection is clearly advantageous. So potentially, maybe this was also true of the Venetians and the Southern Germans and Austrians. There is another factor as well. So aside from bucklers, we start to see small shields being used. Now, if we think about the Scots for a second, they were using a targe. And in fact, various types of targe were used in Wales and also England. And we've got the gun shields off the Mary Rose. Now, if you are using this Indian Dal will have to suffice for a targe, because amazing, I don't own a Highland targe. I need to fix that. But if you're using what's essentially a small shield, so it's bigger than a buckler, but a lot smaller than most earlier shields, then when you're attacking with it, because of the size of this, it is far more likely that your hand is going to project beyond the targe or shield, and potentially you might use it in different ways, therefore, which means the hand's more vulnerable. So maybe because of the size of the shield, it's important to have more hand protection. Now, I don't know whether this was the case with the Venetians. It might be, and this is a really important point, it might be that these three cultures, the Southern Germans and Austrians, the British and the Venetians, they loved basket hilts for different reasons, and that's worth bearing in mind. But is there potentially a relationship between the size of shields used in those areas and the need for a full basket hilt? Do you know? Does the evidence support this? Get posting down below. I'd like to find out more about this. So conjectural point number 3 is, do these somehow relate to, in those areas, these swords being more primary weapons? The reason I thought about this is because of the famous Highland Charge. So whether we're looking at the Jacobite Rebellion of 1715, or whether we're going later to 1745, for example, we do find that unlike British forces, where they have primarily a firearm, but then they have a bayonet on the end, except for the officers, they have a bayonet on the end. So their primary weapon is the long musket with a bayonet fitted on the end. That is essentially a polearm. Conversely, the Scots that they were fighting against the Jacobites, they did have firearms, but they tended to shoot. Oh no, they had artillery as well, but they tended to shoot and then perform what was famously called a Highland Charge, which means covering a lot of ground as quickly as possible and hacking down some government opponents. I won't say English, because those of you who know a lot of the people on the government side at Culloden, for example, were actually Scottish. So the Jacobite Rebellion was a Jacobite rebellion, not a Scottish rebellion, but we won't get into the politics of that right now. So the Highland Charge meant that the sword, claymores and lochaber axes aside, the sword was a primary weapon. Whereas when we look at medieval history, as I've made the point in so many videos, the sword is often a backup weapon to something like a poleaxe or a lance or a spear or a longbow. So in that situation, it's possible that they were using them as a primary weapon. Now, interestingly, there's some evidence to suggest that this was also the case with the Schiavoni, for example, because they often operated on ships and therefore they couldn't carry long pole arms. And yes, okay, you had some people with big spadoni, two-handed swords and stuff like that, but primarily, yes, they operated guns, yes, they were sailors, but their primary weapon, much like later sailors with cutlasses, their primary weapon was actually a sword. So is it possible that the reason that the Schiavoni, the Venetian soldiers, had basket hilts was because that was their primary weapon, much like the Scots? I'm not sure this holds up, unfortunately, in the case of the English with the earliest basket hilts that they had there in the 1520s and 30s, because most of them would have had a primary weapon like a partisan or a halberd or a poleaxe, or they were a longbowman or a gunner. So in that case, it doesn't really stand up. But what do you think? Do you think there's a relationship there between the need for a basket hilt and the fact that that sword is a more important weapon, a more primary weapon for those types of soldiers? Now, conjectural point number 4 is sort of related to the previous one, and it came to me when thinking about cutlasses. So when we're in the 19th century, most infantry officers or cavalry officers have relatively minimal hand protection. Yes, you've got a knuckle bow at the front, you have a degree of shell at the top, and you have some bars on the side, usually. Obviously, light cavalry can have even less than that. They might just have a knuckle bow, which is really no more protection than a lot of 15th century swords offer. So they've got relatively minimal hand protection. So one of the great questions of 19th, 18th and 19th century history, military history, is why do cutlasses have more hand protection? Okay, and one of the usual answers that we give to that is because sailors on board a ship are, number one, using a shorter blade, but they are also using it at very close range. So when we look at light cavalry, they are essentially hit and run. They ride in quickly on their horse, they slash someone or skewer someone, and then they're out again. If there's another cavalry coming at them, they might parry and riposte, and then they're out again. So they are quick passing exchanges. Obviously, that doesn't necessarily stand up in the case of an infantry officer who might be dealing with people who are trying to bayonet him. However, with bayoneting, in that case, you're dealing with thrust. You don't necessarily need a lot of hand protection. But cutlasses, on the other hand, are squished into small, tight spaces, either below decks or on board deck. Masses of people, big old melee. And so these things, a bit like trench fighting, are very close range weapons, and you're far more likely, when defending your head or anything else, to be hit in the hand. So that's the standard explanation for why these have more hand protection. So can we extrapolate that to Scottish and English, Southern German and Austrian and Venetian basket hilts? Maybe. I don't know. What do you think? Do you think that perhaps the nature of fighting in the Highlands of Scotland, or the nature of fighting in the Tudor period in England, or the Venetian navies perhaps that is similar to cutlasses? Do you think these things somehow have a parallel? Do you think that maybe the way that they were fighting, or the nature of the places and the type of warfare they were engaged in, meant that a basket hilt was more important, like with a cutlass? Maybe? I'm not sure. What do you think? Right, so the fifth and final and conjectural point that I'm going to offer is about fencing styles. And obviously this is a chicken and egg argument, because sometimes the fencing style evolves largely because of the weapon, and sometimes the weapon evolves because of the fencing style. The great things is that we actually know a lot about the fencing styles because they've been preserved in treatises or manuals. Now, to just come on to rapiers for a comparable parallel here, potentially, we find that with rapiers that have simple and relatively open swept hilts like this, they are generally used with the hand drawn back and kept close to the body in earlier fencing systems, and therefore the hand isn't particularly vulnerable to the opponent's weapon because it's held away, and by the time you see that the person's going for your hand, you can move the hand somewhere else and deal with that as you need to. However, as we get later on, we see the development of more complex and enclosed cup hilts of various types, whether it's in Germany the Pappenheimer, or in Spain the cup hilt or double shell hilt, clamshell hilt, various different types, and in England we have dish hilts as well. And in those situations we start to see usually the dominant foot come forward and dominant side stay forward more and more as we go forward in history, and the hand and weapon comes more forward because you've got more protection for the hand. Now what's interesting is we see exactly the same thing with cutting swords. So if I just come to the sabre for a second, generally speaking, sabres which don't have an awful lot of hand protection, for example in the Napoleonic era, are fenced from predominantly these hanging guards like prime and seconde up here, or the terce is held quite far back with the hand away from the opponent to make sure that the hand isn't continually being hit by the opponent. So in fact, when we look at the use of hussar sabres, for example, in Angelo and things like this, often terce guard will be quite retracted and quite close to the body to keep the hand away from the opponent. However, later in the 19th century, as sabre guards become, generally speaking, a little bit more protective, we start to see the hand projected a little bit more forward and presented more forward as we've got more hand protection. Now, we have a parallel in the known British Isles, English and Scottish, broadsword systems. And if we go to Zachary Wilde of 1711, for example, his standard guard position, outside guard, doesn't look like how we would hold a sabre down here with the hand behind the blade and the dish of the hilt and like that. We've got a full basket hilt, and we see the same thing in Miller as well, incidentally. And in that case, the hand is held fully out, a bit like their pugilism stances, and it's held fully out in the opponent's face here in an outside guard or an inside guard, because we've got such immense, colossal hand protection. Now, it's a chicken and egg thing. Is it that because they like to fence with their hand fully out, they developed basket hilts, or basket hilts became more popular? Or Is it because they had that protection that gradually they went from a more retracted hand rather here, to being a more extended hand because they realised they could hide the whole sword arm behind that massive hilt and deal with things far away from the body because you've got that enormous amount of protection of that basket in front of you? This is a very complex question to answer, but what we can say is it's very, very evident that the nature of the protectiveness of hilts really goes hand in hand with how those swords were used in their respective cultural fencing systems. So there are some certain things we can say. That the basket hilt conveys a huge amount of hand protection and even protects your arm and your head and every other bit of your body better than just about any other type of hilt. As someone who often fences sabre against these, they can be really difficult to bypass and get around. They occupy a lot of space, especially when someone who fences with a very extended guard position like you would see in Zachary Wilde or Miller, for example. So they are brilliant. I am a big fan of them. I think they look awesome. They definitely function awesome. They're possibly not great to wear around, but I don't have to worry about that on a day-to-day basis. As for why were they used? Well, I've given 5 possible points. I've just made some notes here. So possibly because of bare hands, because of the use of firearms and other things like that. Possibly because of the size of the shields changed, or the shields that were commonly being used were more smaller shields. Possibly because in some cultures, perhaps they were more of a primary weapon rather than a secondary weapon. Possibly. It's very conjectural, that one. Possibly because certain groups of people fought in very close and confined spaces. I think that's perhaps a little bit more plausible, especially when we look at cutlasses as a parallel. And finally, was it just a product of the fencing styles of those particular places or cultures? Bearing in mind, of course, that in Venice, the Schiavona, the basket hilt of Venice, is particularly associated with a particular culture of people as well, who aren't even native to Venice originally. So what do you think? And I think the big unanswered question here, and the one which I think would require vast amounts of research to answer, is why were basket hilts really only ever popular in the British Isles, in Venice, and in southern Germany and what's now Austria? Why? Why only those 3 places? Why? I mean, you do find basket hilts in other places. We'd find some in Norway, for example. You find forms of basket hilt occasionally in Poland, possibly a German influence carryover. So you do find them in other places, but they were never really massively popular outside of these 3 main areas. Why? Why didn't they catch on more? Answers down below, answers on a postcard. I'd be very interested to see your thoughts on this and whether you think I've gone completely wide of the mark, or whether there's just a really simple answer that I've overlooked. Anyway, thanks a lot for watching. As always, please make sure you're subscribed. It makes a huge difference to the channel and who gets to see these videos, and you being recommended these videos in the future. I have, as always, been Matt Easton, and I really hope that I'll continue to be. I'll see you back on the channel really soon. Cheers, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.